Welcome back to Simplifying the State. I'm Adam Watson.
I'm Nicholas Perrin.
Okay, so on today's episode, we're going to be covering a couple of things. We're going to be covering Biden's final address to the UN General Assembly this week, and kind of a subsection of that, like U.S. foreign policy and where that's kind of been at for the last couple of months, and possibly where that will go. How the House avoided a government shutdown with just a couple days to spare, how that works, how that happened, etc. And we're going to be talking about some recent comments made by the Republican who is seeking to be elected as the North Carolina governor. Okay, so let's start off with Biden's speech. So Biden gave his last speech to the UN General Assembly this week when they met for their yearly big meeting of all the different countries. So he talked about a couple things. He talked about global cooperation. He talked about climate change. He talked about support for Ukraine. But a big thing he talked about was there was a kind of standout quote in that where he was kind of talking about like how some things are more important than staying in power. And so he kind of touched on that possibly as like a nod to the benefits and values of democracy for nations possibly like Hungary, where democracy is not a big thing. But he called for unity among allies, reaffirmed U.S. support for Ukraine, stressed the need for climate action, highlighted diplomatic efforts with China, etc. So, I mean, Biden is a pretty big, like, player when it comes to foreign policy. Obviously, he's the president, so he's going to be. But even before he was president, he was a decently sized player in foreign policy when he was the vice president, when he was a senator from Delaware. So, Nicholas, do you think that his decision to step aside will have any impact on possibly how he handles foreign policy going forward?
I mean, because he's going to, not be president in the next term, he might do some more controversial things because there's not a whole lot of reason for him not to, since he doesn't need to care about elections anymore. He can go towards what he more thinks is the right thing to do. And in his speech, he said that for the current Lebanon-Israeli tensions and strikes, he said a diplomatic solution is still possible, and that no one wants full-scale war. He remained a little bit vague on other happenings in the Middle East, especially about the Israel-Gaza situation, but I think we might see more from him in the following months.
Right, yeah, I mean, the situation in the Middle East is obviously at a more uh, strenuous position than it usually is with the conflicts in Gaza, and the increased action from various Iranian proxies like the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then, I mean, obviously, Israel's been conducting operations in Lebanon, so that's been causing some concerns of a wider conflict. But yeah, I think you're right. I think he probably has been. Well, I'm not sure how he was making decisions beforehand about U.S. foreign policy, but I think that if the possibility of will this negatively impact re-election, I think that's definitely out the window. And so now I think he'll focus entirely on like what he thinks is best for the U.S. and for global security. Ukraine was there also. One of the controversial issues, at least internationally, when it comes to foreign policy with Biden regarding Ukraine is how he decides whether or not Ukraine will be able to use its long range missiles in various parts of Russia. So, I mean, there is a little area within Russia that Ukraine is allowed to use its missiles in, which Russia has been using for a staging ground for some of its attacks into Ukraine. Ukraine is wanting to essentially be unchained and be able to use its weapons wherever it wants within Russian territory. Biden has been hesitant because he doesn't want to escalate the conflict even further. So that's possibly something we could see in the coming months. I mean, obviously, every time the U.S. or NATO has set a red line, like we're not going to give Ukraine this, like in a couple months, that red line was gone. I mean, at the start of the war, we weren't going to give them fighter jets and tanks and Patriots and all that such. And I mean, now we're training Ukrainians in F-16s. We're giving them Abrams tanks. So I think that what we see as red lines in the sand now probably, well, possibly won't be there in the next couple of months. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about how the House avoided a government shutdown. So, with days to spare, the House passed a temporary spent funding bill averting a government shutdown. It was then sent to the Senate, where they quickly passed it. Uh, the deal includes funding until December 20th, allowing for more budget negotiations. Um, Controversial elements that some Republicans wanted included in it, like the SAVE Act, were left out to ensure its passage. The SAVE Act would essentially require voters to provide proof of citizenship in order to vote. So that would basically mean like already when you go to vote, you have to provide some form of identification, like a passport, driver's license, something like that. But the SAVE Act would essentially require you to provide some kind of proof of citizenship, like a birth certificate or a citizenship document. I'm not sure the other types of citizenship documents, but something like that to prove that you are a citizen in the U.S. Democrats didn't want to include that because I mean, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote, and so they felt that that would uh, impact voting negatively for people who were U.S. citizens. So it passed the House 341 to 82, passed the Senate 78 to 18. Uh, so Mike Johnson, who has been a somewhat controversial speaker, like his predecessor Kevin McCarthy, he has had to deal with a lot of issues from the more far right part of the Republican Party, and so he had to kind of appeal to Democrats in order to get this passed. Nicholas, what do you think about this funding bill and how it could possibly impact things going forward?
Um, I think the cooperation between the Republican and Democrat representatives in the House is something that you don't see too often, and it's a good sign for things moving forward. However, to be too optimistic about this is not uh, a great prediction.
Right. Right. I think, yeah, you kind of talked about Republicans and Democrats kind of coming together on this basic like issue that should be an easy sell. But I also do think it kind of shows a possible, like, it does kind of show, like, how partisanship is on display, like, how the Republicans' majority is so razor thin that they need to rely on Democrats to pass something like this because they can't get the far right members of the House and the more center Republicans to agree on much. So I think that has been an issue, and I think it's probably why that this House, this Congress, has been one of the least effective Congresses since the Great Depression. Because I think of the sheer just level of partisanship you see with like no side really wanting to come together on anything unless it's like averting a government shutdown. But it was sent to Biden's desk, where he then signed it. If no agreement was reached, then the government would have shut down on Tuesday. It also provides an additional 231 million for the Secret Service. Obviously, the Secret Service has been in some hot water recently with the two attempted assassination of Trump's attempts on Donald Trump, and possibly them needing more resources to better protect the large list of people that they need to protect. So moving on, let's get to our final topic, which is the North Carolina governor's race. So the race is between two candidates, Josh Stein, who is the Democrat, and then Mark Robinson, who is the Republican, and he's also the lieutenant governor. So last week, he got into some hot water over controversial comments he made on an online forum. Uh, Amongst the statements set, this is still alleged as he denies it was him, but there is evidence to suggest and prove that he was the one who was making these messages. So one of the things he said was he referred to himself as a black Nazi. He expressed support for reinstating slavery, and he said, "I quote, I'd buy some." He said a bunch of things like that. So, Nicholas, how do you think that this could impact not only the governor's race in North Carolina, but also possibly just how it goes for Republicans statewide at the presidential level?
Well, I think this is a pretty terrible situation for really all Republicans in North Carolina, even outside North Carolina. What Mark Robinson said was it could be interpreted as a joke if it was him. However, what he said, I think, is pretty interesting in that it refers to some of it refers to what Republicans are trying to add on to their campaign and what they're trying to run for or against. So I think it could affect the um, elections and views on him and other Republican leaders in and outside North Carolina. However, I think that it won't affect it too much because, like you said, things are still alleged and they can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways.
Right. Although I think there has been some recent progress for the situation to get a whole lot worse for him. The Republican Governors Association announced they were going to cut off funding for his campaign. A bunch of his staffers quit. Most Republicans have kind of come out against these comments, obviously, because, I mean, even if they're a joke, they're pretty bad. And if they're not, then they're like outright terrible. I mean, they're just terrible comments. Like advocating for slavery to come back is bad, obviously. Um, I mean, I think this could really impact the presidential election because, I mean, Donald Trump has referred to him as, I believe the quote was, he's Martin Luther King Jr. Times two, I believe the quote was. So he has made a lot of statements in support of Mark Robinson, and so that and he and JD Vance have not necessarily come out against these statements that the lieutenant governor possibly made. And so I think that could possibly hurt him in North Carolina, where the margins are extremely close. And so if you can get, if Democrats get like just 10,000 people or so to stay home because they don't want to go out and support this candidate for governor, I mean, I think that could possibly be the determining amount of voters in deciding who gets North Carolina's electoral votes. What do you
Also,
think?
I would like to say the quote was not MLK times two, it was Martin Luther King on steroids.
Ah, okay. Yeah, because I wasn't quite sure and I didn't have it in front of me. What do you think?
Um, yeah, I guess it could, in fact, change the presidential election quite a bit if this was brought to the public's eye a lot and stays in the public's eye. However, knowing how social media, news networks, and all that works, I don't think it's going to make a large impact because people will likely forget even in like a month or two.
Right, right. Although I think we are like just, I think it was like maybe 30-ish days out from the election, 37. So, I mean, I think even with uh, people who are, even with the public's kind of goldfish like memory, they don't really focus on this stuff. I think it came out soon enough that it could have an impact on the election. All right. Thank you for listening to Simplifying the State. We'll be back next week with a new episode. So stay tuned for that. Talk to you then.